Welcome back to the Good Karma podcast, the podcast that delves deep into the intricate world of mental health and its connection to fields ranging from sociology all the way to philosophy. I'm your host, Jackson Kang, and today I am joined by Dr. Shari Brink and Emily Gordon. First off, hi, Shari and Emily. I want to thank you so much for joining me on the Good Karma podcast. And without further ado, could you please introduce yourselves to the audience?
Sure. I'm Dr. Shari Brink. Most people just call me Shari, and I am the president and CEO of Blanton Peel Institute and Counseling Center. We are a mental health nonprofit in New York City. We're in Lower Midtown, and we provide affordable, accessible mental health care, and we train mental health professionals. I've been here for about 9 years, and it's been one of the great pleasures of my professional life.
And my name is Emily Gordon. I also just go by Emily. I am the community clinician at Blanton Peel Institute and Counseling Center. So my role focuses mainly on bringing therapy to the community. Sometimes we've noticed that folks have a hard time getting through the intake process and not knowing what's on the other end. And so my role exists to really bring therapy to the community.
Great. Thank you so much. So, first question is, Sherry and Emily, what are some memorable experiences that you've had at your time at Blanton Peel?
Maybe I'll go first and go broad, and then Emily will bring a more specific perspective on Blanton Peel. For
Yes.
me, I would name, I guess, three things. Back in 2017, we expanded Blanton Peel to a second floor. We've been all on one floor, and now we're on two floors, and that meant we could double our capacity and our impact on mental health in New York City. The second thing is a little bit like that and comes to my mind in 2020, specifically March 13, 2020, we pivoted due to a little thing called the pandemic. We pivoted to being all virtual, both our training programs and all of our sessions of therapy. And at that point, we were providing about 30,000 sessions a year of mental health therapy. It had all been in person, but suddenly we were completely remote. And so that pandemic pivot is really memorable for me. But I think more important than either of those two things, and Emily can give you a little bit more perspective on actually both of these things, is the way we've been engaging the community. Two things come to my mind, something we call the BIPOC Mental Health Fellowship. And secondly, the ways we are going out into the community, meeting people where they are in order to begin conversations about mental health and well-being.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that. I think one of my memorable moments definitely centers around the BIPOC fellowship group that we have. I had the honor of supervising two of our BIPOC interns fellows, and my most memorable moment with them was their graduation. We had a lovely circle with just the supervisors and the interns, which I think is so important to like honor that intimacy and that like privacy that exists between those relationships. And really for the first time being able to hear the impact of having a BIPOC clinician mentoring a BIPOC intern and understanding the experience that I have long forgotten now because I've been in this field for 8 years. But remembering how hard it can be being a BIPOC clinician in this field and just being really grateful for the space that exists to reflect on that and grow from that and remember that I have a role in that as well in that formation. So that's definitely my memorable moment with the interns. I'll say a client moment as well. I think some of our youngest patients at Blanton Peel and have gotten to work with them for 2 years now, almost 2 years, and they're about to graduate from the trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy that we're doing, which is lovely. They've been writing letters to themselves about what they've learned and then what they want to remember. And so it's really been wonderful seeing, just young people under 13 be able to talk about mental health in such yeah, such a holistic way. And then to talk with their parents and really partner with them, and then also allow them to see the space that they've created for their children. So those are definitely my top two.
That's great to hear. I would imagine that as a mental health therapist, it would be very rewarding not just to see the results, but also to kind of enjoy the process. Like I'm a very fervent believer that the process, um, like you should value the process over the results, and it seems that you
Yeah.
definitely do, and you can definitely apply that philosophy to mental health, and I think that it'll, or mental health therapy specifically, and I think that that'll really work well. I'm just curious. So Blanton Peel must have treated a good number of young adults during your time working there. What are some of the most reoccurring issues that you saw during your years of experience?
Mhm.
Hmm. I can definitely tackle this question for Sherry if that feels
Yeah,
comfortable.
that'd be great. Yep.
Yeah. So I think of young adults and young folks in like stages. So we have like our 0 to 5, we have our 5 to like 10, 12, and then we have our teenagers that are and emerging adults. So everybody has their unique obstacle or challenge that they are confronting, but I think what I have noticed is an overall like theme and pattern, is like validation, is really
Mm,
acknowledging that what they're experiencing is valid in a world where adults' experiences sometimes tend to be a little bit more valid, a little bit more
mm,
recognized, even more portrayed in media, and in film. And so I think for me, when I work with younger folks, it's really important for me to um, get on their level and also acknowledge and validate that whatever it is that they're going through is important, and the feelings that are attached to that are just as important, just as sacred as someone who is going through something very, very different. But I think there's a lot of comparison culture in the folks that I see in terms of, well, my parent or my guardian is dealing with like bills, and so I shouldn't bother them around that because they're providing for me, or my parents are going through divorce, and so that's bigger than what it is that I'm feeling. Even with the folks that I've worked with who have gone through some horrible traumas, in their minds they'll tell me, well, my mom has to deal with their child having been traumatized. And I just find how much weight the younger folks take on, and that's been something that has been very prevalent, at least in the folks that I've worked with. Yeah.
I
I
think
think
that's such
that's
an interesting perspective on the different generational challenges, Emily. It, I'm convinced that the isolation that people experience in our culture is so devastating, and it's one of the core impacts on mental health and well-being. We are not as mentally well when we feel isolated as when we feel connected and have a sense of belonging. And when youth or anyone don't experience a sense of validation, that just contributes to the sense of isolation.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely a valid point. Humans are social creatures, and I think that really the health of the individual does indeed affect the health of the society surrounding them. Um,
Yeah.
and definitely, like, I think that if you even break it down to the simplest social group, which I think is the family, like if you have one person suffering in the family, then that definitely resonates throughout the larger social groups, and the whole family as a whole definitely suffers. And so when you have a society as large as a city or a country, I definitely believe that even if the health of one individual person is suffering, I really think that that has a ripple effect throughout um, larger social groups. And so I definitely see that point, Cherry.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, when 20% of people, which is a pretty consistent stat across the city, across the country, are dealing with mental illness. And when you think, as you've just said, Jackson, about the impact then on others, you know, as I walk down the street in New York, most people are dealing with mental illness in one way, shape, or form, either for themselves or for those they love and care about.
Mhm. And so, Emily, I know that you led a Blanton Peel initiative that ran, and please correct me if I'm wrong, group conversations around mental health in a New York City alternative high school. And so, could you please expand a bit more on that initiative? Kind of what were some important themes or trends that you saw from that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, you got it right. I
Thank you.
am leading different groups, mental health workshops, and then we did one really fun and exciting relaxation station fair to kind of culminate the entire experience. It all started with a partnership with the high school where we were able to speak with school staff, mainly guidance counselors and social workers, to see what is the need, what's going on with the students, and how could we help? How could we support what's already happening in the high school? And much like we were talking about earlier, spaces is what's really needed probably everywhere. Space to be heard, space to voice what's going on, space to not feel isolated in your experience. And so what we really did was create that space during lunchtime,
Mhm.
which was fun because it's a smaller time. So we provided pizza, and it was just a very nice, not laid back because we are talking about mental health, but I would say grounded, perhaps would be a better word. Grounded time for students who were interested. It wasn't mandatory. Anyone who wanted to join could join. Um, where we got to talk a lot about what is mental health? What does it mean to create a protection plan? How can we identify symptoms that range from, you know, worrisome to now we need to go and call somebody. Now we need to have people enter into our lives, or we need to advocate for somebody else. The biggest patterns that I think, or trends, or things that united us all in that space was wanting to just have time to speak on these things. And um, we had a focus group after we finished the workshops and the groups, and everyone was, I want to say, pretty much unanimous that this space was important, and they wished that more people would come. Something I did notice is that the word mental health sometimes still has this really negative connotation, and so we wanted to be very transparent, and we said these are mental health like pizza chats. But even that word mental health had folks, you know, saying well, I don't need that. And I know that we don't agree with what I'm about to say, but these are the real life quotes from some students like, "Oh, I'm not crazy. I don't need to go in that group." And that's just not the case. Mental health is for everybody. And I saw the need to continue to destigmatize what it really means when we say mental health. How do we make that word more accessible, more inclusive, so that folks know that everybody can be a part of those conversations, and it's not exclusive to, you know, I think what we still have in our minds when it comes to mental health.
Mhm.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That I think that the best way to destigmatize kind of the word mental health and everything around it is to really just have more open spaces um,
Yeah.
that promote mental wellness. And I think that just through repetition and kind of just exposing that, it's really only human to, sometimes have uh, mental health problems. That I think that is really the only way to really
Yeah,
destigmatize that. So,
yeah. And it's so ironic, isn't it? I mean, the word the words mental health have taken on their own meaning, because one of those words is health, which means something positive, right? Well-being. But when you put the two words together, mental health, our brains, I'm convinced they automatically hear illness. And
Yep.
as you use the words craziness, that kind of connotation. Jackson, I have heard you say on occasion, mental wellness. And I tend to use the phrase mental health and well-being in order to reverse what our brains automatically do with the phrase. Because what we're looking for is to help people be the kind of people who, not that they're always happy, not that they're always, wow, isn't life great, but that they're able to deal with what comes their way, and that's what well-being is. I don't think our goal is for our youth to never feel sad or have experiences that are difficult. They will, and it seems to me our goal is to help equip youth and adults to deal with what comes their way. I'd be interested in both your reactions to what I just said.
I mean, yeah, I think you kind of put that perfectly right there. I think that it's very unrealistic to say that, oh, by practicing meditation, for example, you're never going to feel sad again. I think that is the total opposite of what mental wellness is about. It's about having the facility to deal with challenges that you come across and to build that resilience and to practice techniques that you can in times of challenges. Yes, you will be knocked down, but it's kind of about how you deal with it and how you respond back. And I think that by practicing meditation or mindfulness, that they really do help with dealing with these challenges in life and kind of building up the character to respond back even when things aren't looking super great.
Yeah, I also think that we see this problem or challenge is probably a better word in the therapy room. So in a similar way, when you take a deep breath and ground yourself and you try and enter into meditation, and then a minute in you ask yourself, now what's supposed to happen in the therapy room? After a couple of months, we'll see some clients say, well, shouldn't I be better by now? Like, I'm not seeing anything drastically change. And it's about the process. I remember, Jackson, that you said that it doesn't always have to be about the end result, but we get so fixated on that, and mental health then becomes the goal towards healthy, towards wellness. And I challenge that a lot in the therapy room with my clients, and I say, well, we're implying then that there's something inherently wrong with you. And I'm not saying that there aren't things that can be challenged or can be reflected on, but when we start with, well, I am bad, so I must be good now, we're already starting to speak negatively about ourselves. So if we could reframe that and say, well, I am wanting to work on things, but I have a lot of strengths already, and I'd like to add to that, it already shifts the conversation a bit versus I need to change, and turn it into, well, I have a lot of things that I'm proud of and that I feel strong in. How could I build on that?
Mhm.
That's cool. That's cool, Emily. I like that.
So, all the statistics and numbers point to an incredible rise in mental health issues in young adults since World War II. I did my research on that. So, what do you think is kind of the main culprit here, and how can we really deal with that?
I think we've already said one thing about this, which is that loneliness and disconnect.
Mm,
These are the loneliness and the disconnect is contributing to a lower sense of mental health and well-being. And the idea of, we can think back to sitcoms about 1950s life, and people having conversations around their dinner table. Well, some families still have that, but many, or maybe even most, don't. And so in the family unit, there's a sense of disconnect. In social media, we could talk about the impact of social media. We could talk about the impact of just the volatility and the hostility that exists in our culture. And it seems like it's an iterative process. All of these things build on each other. You know, and I think it's really important to recognize that some of what's going on in our culture and in our society have a disproportionate impact on certain parts of the population. The impact of racism on people of color, the impact of hostility toward LGBTQ people, which, you know, some of us thought that that was winding down, but it's back with a vengeance. So the impact on young queer people, and you know, you see that in the statistics. Young queer people considering and attempting suicide at 2 and 3 times the rate. Sometimes I've heard 4 times the rate of other youth. Girls still have a harder time with mental health and well-being, show a disproportionate impact. So the disparities in our culture, I think it's important to, and that youth in general, Emily has in some ways said this, that while the mental health and well-being of adults is not going in a positive direction, the mental health and well-being of youth is going in the wrong direction at a higher rate, at a more rapid rate of speed. Emily, what do you think are the culprits?
I definitely think it's hard to pinpoint one culprit for this, but Shari, you mentioned something really important, which is trauma. And I would add generational trauma, thinking about that like 1950s sitcom dinner table. I wonder how much generational trauma is not being named, but is being felt and being seen in those tables.
Yeah.
And I think that we're seeing that a lot in our youth, is the skeletons, ghosts that haunt their parents or that haunt the generations that raised them, start getting passed down and nobody's saying anything.
Yeah.
You know, mom is crying in the bathroom, but we don't really know why. There are strict rules around like sleeping over other people's houses because perhaps there was sexual assault in generational history, but no one talks about that. And so there's this othering, but no one knows why. There's this isolation, and again, no one knows what for. And I see that a lot in my practice, just having folks kind of question these family values that feel uncomfortable, feel unhealthy, but that nobody is really addressing. And it goes back to what we were saying before, is that when experiences go unnamed and without validation, isolation takes root, and that leads to so many different things. So because I am someone who works a lot with the family, especially in my work with younger folks, I do think that like this like disrupt in communication between generations is a big one. Even if there is no generational trauma present, the inability to go to your caregiver and really say, hey, I'm not feeling well, I need your support, is detrimental to mental health.
Yeah, and going back to the topic of social media, I actually find that kind of ironic because we're like, you want to increase the interconnectedness, which in theory social media should do, but I think that in doing that, there's a level of authenticity that is lost in promoting social media use. And so you find that in theory, you know, social media should connect more people around the world, but it's just not an authentic connection, and that actually exacerbates the situation surrounding social media.
It has proven to be a pretty hostile place to operate, not a safe space, which we said that safe spaces are important. And then, you know, Emily used a phrase earlier, the comparison culture. It really exacerbates the comparison culture.
Yeah,
Definitely.
not to mention the many Instagram, TikTok therapists that exist and sometimes spread misinformation. Not to say that this is a generalization of all therapists that you'll find on social media. But once things start trending, we start taking them as law, as like truth and as facts. And I'll have clients come in and like double check things with me. And sometimes I'm like, yeah, that's great. Let's talk about that. Let's have a conversation about neurodivergence in our session. But sometimes it is misinformation, and it's not within the full context of yeah, of I don't know, like a 60-second reel.
Yep.
And so I know we focused a lot on youth mental health, and what youths can do, I guess, to improve mental wellness and the mindset that they can adopt. But what advice would you give to parents and educators in supporting the mental health and educational and emotional development of children and adolescents?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a broken record. So I'll say it a little differently. I'll start off sounding like a broken record, which is create space for your children, for the, you know, the youth under your care. Um, but also I think my biggest recommendation would be do not internalize what it is that they are bringing to you. I see that a lot, is that when someone says I'm sad, a parent or a caregiver, guardian will take that on and say, I've made you sad. And then it quickly becomes about how the, you know, the caregiver feels. And it's like, I did something wrong. I'm failing as a parent. And in that, those spaces are important to have. But when you are with your child who is telling you that you are sad, that becomes the important part of the conversation. You can process some of the other parts later. But often what I see in therapy is that someone expressing, oh, I'm scared or I'm sad, quickly becomes, I did a bad job. You shouldn't be scared, so I failed. And I want to validate that feeling in the parents and in the caregivers. And maybe if we reframe that as this emotion is an invitation to understanding your child's like process, emotional process, thought process versus a child's attack on your parenting, then we could actually get somewhere. We can collect more data and see, oh, they're feeling sad because of something that happened at school today, not because of something that you said last night as a parent. So those are my 2 cents. And I say that not being a parent, just having worked with them. So I really want to acknowledge that as well. I don't have that personal experience.
You can get it in what Emily has said about how what one part of the family, but it doesn't have to be the family as we've traditionally defined it. Oops, sorry about that. How what happens in one part of a system can kind of reverberate back and forth between the individuals in that system. She mentioned the impact that a child saying I'm suffering can have on a parent or caregiver. But earlier she mentioned it in the other direction, that the parent struggling can, the kid can end up feeling like, oh, I'm not supposed to put that on my parents. I can't really express that. It just can kind of reverberate back and forth.
Yep.
Pinging around within the people who are connected to each other.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting phenomenon because, like, it's almost like as as a child, like you want to succeed, but you also want to see your parents succeed, and it's like the whole family to kind of flourish. So if one member of the family incurs a challenge, it's almost like the whole family is also incurring a challenge. And definitely you see that reverberating effect on a wide scale. So yeah, I definitely see what you're saying. And lastly, it's the last question. If you were to rewind time and give advice to your 18-year-old self, what would you say? Like, what would your advice be for young adults who want to practice mental wellness today?
Well, you're asking me to think back a long time, Jackson.
Sorry about that.
But I would say trust yourself, be yourself, and find spaces where that can be true. Trust yourself, be yourself, and find spaces where that can be true.
That's great. I'm struggling a little bit with this question because there's so many things I would tell myself. I think I would say I see things a lot in parts. So like IFS, modality, internal family systems theory puts forth that we are made up of a lot of different parts. So I would say trust your parts because I think sometimes I felt like there were parts of me that were not trustworthy and they were really just trying to help, and I would have like a little warning voice in my head and I would ignore that because um yeah, I just wouldn't trust myself. And so I think that self-trust, so if I could put that in a different term for my younger self to understand, because she didn't know about IFS or internal parts, it would be to trust yourself, trust your instinct, and lean on the people who are showing up for you, because that's something that I wish I recognized a little bit more in that isolation season, which I think characterizes so many of our adolescent stages of life, is that I felt so alone, and that veiled me from really being able to see all of the other people available to me, from the guidance counselor, who actually is the reason why I am in this profession, to my family members, my friends. So those would be the words I tell myself.
Yeah. And actually is kind of similar to a piece of advice I heard from a teacher once, where it's like the strongest seed can't grow on concrete, where it's like you always want to put yourself in, trust yourself and recognize if the situation around you is hard to grow in, you can divert and go in another direction. Um, so that is a quote that's always stuck with me, and
It's a good one.
definitely,
Yeah.
I feel like it aligns with what you're saying. So yeah, I think that was a very productive discussion around mental health, and hopefully the audience uh, really learned from that experience. I think that Shari and Emily, you all gave some really important insights, and I would like to thank you for coming onto this podcast and sharing your insights to the whole world. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackson. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and thanks for creating this conversation and creating this safe space to have a conversation.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jackson.
Thank you. Thank you. This podcast is sponsored by the Mind Matter Foundation, a nonprofit committed to making the world a better place, one mind at a time. The Mind Matter Foundation is committed to funding several local community initiatives that will help foster mental wellness in all people. If you wish to donate to the Mind Matter Foundation, there will be a link to a GoFundMe in the description of this video. Thank you once again for listening to this podcast.